Hey guys, this is Angela with Land Central, and today I want to talk about deed restrictions. So what is a deed restriction? So a deed restrictions are written agreements that restrict or limit the use or activities that may take place on a property in a subdivision. These restrictions appear in the real property records of the county in which the property is located. They are private agreements and are binding upon every owner in a subdivision. The seller may add a restriction to the title of the property. Often, developers restrict the parcels of a property in a development to maintain a certain amount of uniformity. The person conveying the land, known as the grantor, can create a deed restrictions by placing them in the deed to the buyer or grantee. Deed restrictions apply to all owners of the property, not just the person who owns it when the restriction goes into effect. That means a deed restriction put in place a century ago could affect your property now. Non-deed restricted land simply refers to land with no deed restrictions. A lot of deeds these days will have a general clause that states that the property is subject to all easements, right-of-ways, deed restrictions, and so on. So sometimes the updated deed won't list out the specific restrictions put on the property or subdivision and might take some additional research. While some restrictions, like those based on race or religion, have been made illegal and unenforceable, most are allowed, enforced, and travel with the deed. I've actually seen some old deeds where the subdivision has restricted ownership based on color and religion on older deeds. So having a deed restriction removed is usually difficult according to Realtor.com, but can be done. The county courthouse where the property is located will have a copy of the restrictions or covenants for your address or your property or your parcel. You may need to obtain consent from any person with a right to enforce the deed restrictions before you can actually remove the restrictions. For example, if your deed restriction applies to or benefits one or more of your neighbors, you will need that neighbor's permission before you can remove restrictions. Don't confuse deed restrictions with zoning restrictions. Restrictive covenants or deed restrictions or CC&Rs are not the same as a land use zoning. Deed restrictions also run with the land, meaning that the change in land ownership does not change the restriction. Zoning restrictions regulate how the properties in a zoning classification can be used and developed. To find out whether a specific property has any deed restrictions, you can ask the owner or property agent to provide you with the details, and if they don't have them handy, then deed restrictions on a property might be found researching either the deed or the restriction at the county clerk's official public records search. You might have to pull up previous deeds where the deed restrictions were actually listed on older deeds. Generally speaking, deed restrictions do not expire. So, unless there's a specified written expiration date, which I have seen on a deed before, where they have to give a certain amount of time for something to be used or something to access, otherwise it's no longer valid. If the deed restriction is tied to HOA covenants, it's possible for an HOA to vote to extend the time limit on the restriction and to add an expiration date. Another difference is that zoning ordinances are regulations recorded as local laws on the books, whereas covenants are recorded in private deeds, either as a deed restriction or as a neighborhood contracts between private parties. Because covenants are voluntary, they may be more restrictive than zoning ordinances. If a deed restriction is not enforceable, you can choose to ignore it and take on the risk of a neighbor filing suit. Or you can seek out a judge's ruling to have the covenant removed from the deed. Restrictive covenants can be written into deeds relatively easy when a property is sold. It is important to understand the difference between a deed restriction, an HOA covenant, or CC&Rs, and the zoning restriction. So we hope you enjoyed this video today and wish you luck on your vacant land search. Please check out our properties at www.landcentral.com And you can subscribe to our YouTube or like this video. And until next time, have a wonderful, wonderful day.